Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken Shorjan, and I'm here with the great London Paul. And today we are going to look at some of the events that took place over the weekend in regards to actually going back maybe a little bit of last week to Kursk and what happened at the nuclear power plant. Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of the discussion. And there's really no logic or underlying reason why Zelensky would do this at this point in time rather than seeking negotiations, but maybe there's some ulterior points as to why he would actually do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And just a small point, and this may seem petty, but it's important. I've spoken for a long time about people being informed and not entertained. And the whole thing we've seen with regards to social media in recent days, the whole Kursk thing, has just highlighted just how many people are at best entertainers and at worst a lot less of a polite description of their behavior. They just demonstrated all the way along they don't know anything about Ukraine or the war. They're just making things up. They saw the Ukraine war as an opportunity to make a name for themselves, which they have done, and they've made money from it because the X platform is very good at getting people to generate revenue. You can make very controversial comments, get lots of people replying, you earn revenue from it. They can also earn revenue, obviously, from other platforms. And therefore, it's conducive to encouraging people to behave irresponsibly and to just blatantly tell barefaced lies. But also in the process, and we saw this when Russia obviously retreated from Kharkov and Kherson back over the river, and everyone, all these Russian channels claiming that Russia had lost the war and it was the end. And of course, they did it again because of what happened in Kursk, the region, when the Ukrainians invaded. And it's just a small point, just deal with people who actually have something objective to discuss and not people just making up suppositions and coming to conclusions based on simple facts and then trying to conflate that with something else. So just obvious examples are, well, the purpose of Zelensky invading Russia was to destroy the gas substation just over the border, which obviously effectively feeds the pipeline through Ukraine and as west to Slovakia and then to other parts of Europe, and that still provides about 15 billion cubic meters of gas in 2023. So, it's pretty substantial. We're not talking about piffling amounts of gas still that are being shipped or piped through there. So that was number one. And then the obvious next breath is, oh no, well, they didn't blow that thing up. They didn't destroy that. Oh, it must be the Kursk nuclear power plant they're going to blow up and destroy. And this is very easy to say, but it's very difficult to justify in the context, which we'll come on to why those statements, rather like all the statements about that the US wants to go to war with Iran, and pretty much hardly anyone else said it. Most people completely disagreed with me and had loads of abuse for it. Well, the US still hasn't gone to war with Iran. And it hasn't gone to war with Iran because it doesn't want to. Just because I didn't mention it, the gas, obviously, pumping station is Sudza. It's 10 kilometers over the border in Russia. So let's just briefly discuss what happened. And then, as you say, Ken, what was the rationale for doing this? Well, obviously, on the 6th of August, Ukrainian forces entered Kursk and they made a certain degree of progress. It appears as though to a lot of people, the Russians were asleep at the wheel. They weren't there. Okay, they've now responded and they've started to strike back, and there's been reports of 1,350 Ukrainians being killed and dozens of tanks, etc., being destroyed. Okay, it's far from over. but the Russians are in control. And I use the point, the Ukrainians could not defend themselves against the Russian offensive we've seen in the summer. So how are they exactly going to take the war to Russia, in Russia, with what? How many forces? There's rumors now there's a maximum about 6,000 to 8,000. We've already maybe 1,300 are being killed, and who knows how many other are injured. You're really going to take a country the size of Russia with that many military personnel? I mean, it's just nonsense. So the argument is, why did Zelensky do this? Now, you make a point, Ken. There are rumors, and I would suggest, and I really emphasize the fact, rumors. There's nothing to substance, perhaps this, but maybe there will be. That there's a lot of military personnel, etc., who are furious that Zelensky did this because they've had to divert military personnel from the contact line, be it Donbass, even as far south as Zaporizhzhia. Therefore, because they've left gaps there, Russia's now making swift progress along that contact line. That's one thing. The other thing is, rightly, the feeling is they're just being put in a meat grinder, and they'll all end up being killed. So for what purpose was this? What did Zelensky seriously imagine he could achieve? There's been a lot of conjecture that Zelensky's been demanding an offensive for a long time. You make the point, Ken, could this be that he's now finally realizing himself the war's lost? This is an act of desperation. We've seen it in history, where the Germans did this in World War II, where they were lost and then they went on crazy offensives to try and regain the initiative, and it was a total disaster. So it does happen. It is desperation, because they can't win a conflict inside Russia. And I always come back to the point, and it's very simple. Anyone who thinks that Ukraine could beat Russia fails to recognize Russia is a nuclear power. Russia has very clearly stated, if there is an existential threat we cannot respond to, and effectively, we've reached the bottom line, we will use nuclear weapons. So how is Ukraine going to win in that situation? It's impossible. So the best Ukraine can do from their perspective is try to secure where they lose as little territory as possible. They're not going to get Crimea back, or Donbass, or Zaporizhzhia, or Kherson, but the argument is, the longer the war drags on, the risk is Russia will take over the territories. So it's an act of desperation. There was a feeling from some reports it could have been a PR stunt that went horribly wrong. They could take pictures and go, look, we're inside Russia. There's also a belief that Zelensky thought that they could take certain regions and then use that as a trade-off, going, well, you can have these regions back in Russia if we get our regions back in Ukraine. I mean, this is just absolutely farcical. There's no reality to it whatsoever. It's just not going to happen. So the only conclusion you can come to in all this, and with regards to destroying the pumping station, well, yes, they could have done, but here's the point. It's one thing claiming Russia's attacking Ukrainian assets on Ukrainian soil, but if you start then going onto Russian territory and destroying those assets, no one can possibly expect anyone to believe that it was the Russians who did it. I mean, what? So the Ukrainians invade the country and then Russia decides to destroy these assets? No chance. No one is going to be able to believe that or sell that. The same goes with Kursk, the nuclear power plant. If they were to attempt to destroy it, the consequences for Ukraine will be catastrophic. So we have to hope nothing like this ever happens. And you make the point, Ken, the risk as well is that this could then change from a special military operation to a war. If that happens, that will be catastrophic. So everyone has to hope that never happens. So these stories or claims that, well, there was some substance to it, that there were missile fragments found near Kursk nuclear power plant, doesn't mean they were attacking the nuclear power plant. Sometimes missiles will be intercepted and they still travel 20, 30 kilometers before they hit the ground or partially hit the ground. So again, there's no substance. This is just circumstantial evidence which supports a narrative and sounds very enthralling and entertaining to people. It doesn't, I'm not saying it's not possibly correct, but given the Russian response thus far, it doesn't suggest that they believe that themselves. The attitude they're having, and it's from what Putin came out and said today, is we'll rectify this problem within Russia, and the special military operation, quote, will fulfill its objectives. Yes, they've talked about what they say is terrorist attack because they attack civilian, facilities, which appears to have happened, which is an act of terrorism. It is a war crime. So they have made reference to that. But Russia's not gone over the top about this. They think it's probably business as usual. The argument could be Russia knew full well this was happening. And why wouldn't they? They have satellite technology. They know where the Ukrainian armed forces are going, where they've been. They would have surely have seen this. People are saying why it wasn't the fortification on the border. If you put fortification on the border, how does Russia get over that fortification if they want to invade Ukraine? You only put fortification in to defend yourself, not you then later go, oh, now I need to find a way of changing that so I can use it in an offensive capacity. So that's not really a surprise. But overall, it's just crass stupidity, it's desperation, and the feeling that everybody knows Ukraine's lost the war. Now people will deny this. The Americans have come out and said we knew nothing about it, and I quite believe them on this. There's been certainly clear evidence in the last 2.5 years of big disagreement between the Ukrainians and the Americans, whether Zelensky wants to do something, and the Americans said it's not happening. Absolutely no chance. Because again, it's the Americans don't want to end up at war with the Russians. The other point worth making, this always happens every time. There are Poles, French, whoever, killed, captured. It's NATO forces. No, it's not. They're mercenaries. Just because they're Polish doesn't mean they necessarily have any affiliation to NATO at all. And people need to stop making those assumptions because they're assumptions not based on fact. So I think obviously a good point for you to chip in, Ken, on your thoughts. And I know you wanted to mention also about Zaporizhzhia.
Yeah, and it just to tie into what you just said, we have to remember that initially, before the U.S. was involved in the war, there were American mercenaries that were in Spain in 1939 during the Spanish Civil War. Ernest Hemingway wrote about that in his book For Whom the Bell Tolls. We had Americans who were involved in Britain helping out the RAF during the bombing of Britain. We had the Americans who were in Burma fighting against Japan. So mercenaries, it's not a new thing. We think of Blackwater and we think of all these others. They're these private security groups. It's not a new thing. It's been around. The French Foreign Legion has been around for over 100 years. But with that being said, there are also 2 points in history that are significant when it comes to small attacks on an enemy's own land in order to achieve some sort of goal. I remember, in history, the RAF. It was being decimated by German Luftwaffe, and they made a daring raid on Berlin. Now, in that case, Adolf Hitler was so outraged that he stopped bombing the industrial plants and instead went after the cities and the people. And that was one of his biggest mistakes in losing that war, losing that conflict. Then, of course, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, people were so demoralized, you had the Jimmy Doolittle raids on Tokyo. In the end, it wasn't going to really accomplish anything agenda-wise or goal-wise, but it was enough to make the Japanese suddenly say, we're not superior, we're not infallible, we're not superior. The same thing with Germany. So these little things can cause a disruption and a change that potentially can alter a conflict. In this case, not a chance. My guess is, and this is speculation based on a number of things. There's 3 points. One, I think Zelensky is politically on razor's edge. Those who propped him up in power, eventually Ukraine losing, they're gonna want a scapegoat, and he's gonna be the guy. The second thing is that NATO, the United States, and that they are getting tired of the Ukraine conflict. It has not gone the way they wanted, and frankly, they just want to get out of it. But they can't really publicly come out and say that they want to get out of it. So what do? What does Zelensky do? He needs to regain their support somehow, and by attacking Russia on their soil, possibly he's thinking that this is one way that, okay, NATO and Europe and the United States are going to keep funding me and bringing more armaments. The last thing, of course, is that this is, as you mentioned before, a last-ditch desperation that potentially could cause political upheaval in Moscow and be a blight on Putin's popularity by allowing this to happen. Inevitably, none of these are going to occur, but madmen or desperate men do desperate things with an intention that isn't based in reality.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that even you see in Western attitudes, there's a huge shift. There's a huge recognition increasingly that he's lost the war. There's a lack of confidence in him. I mean, there's Western newspaper articles deeply critical, even in the last 6 months, of Zelensky and policy decisions, things he wanted to do, and then claim the Americans didn't want him to do it. And, a lot of people get very confused because they know I'm very anti-America's foreign policy with justifiable reason. But, I'm not going to then sit there and accuse the Americans of everything if they're not doing things. The Americans are very much complicit in large parts of the Ukraine war, but there are certain things where the Americans have done everything to prevent the kind of escalation that could have sucked them directly into the war with Russia. And for very obvious reasons, we've said this before, because they don't want to have to face off against Russia in any conflict, because they know what the outcome will be. And at the end of the day, the only reason the Americans would ever go to war with Russia is if Russia attacked the United States, which they're never going to do. They're not going to go to war directly with Russia over Ukraine. Ukraine isn't worth it. It was a tool to try and beat Russia with, and it's failed. They have to lick their wounds, accept it's over, which increasingly they do, and realize there is no way that the outcome of the war is going to change. And I think increasingly they do understand that. They do realize that. And I think the final point worth making on this, Ken, is the issue of Zaporizhzhia. Now, obviously, let's phrase it from an objective standpoint. There was clearly an instant where it looks like the cooling towers, or one of them of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, was satellite. There was an attack. The Russians claiming it's a Ukrainian drone. It wasn't like a stray missile, missile interception, something went wrong. We know Ukraine in the past has been accused of trying to attack Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and because it's in Ukraine, they can blame it on the Russians. And that's the difference between it being in Kursk and trying to blame it on the Russians. It won't wash. It won't wash really in Ukraine, but it has more credibility. Well, Ukraine's the invading force. They destroyed it. But of course, this was an attack on the cooling tower itself. That's bad enough. but there was a fire which burned through its internal infrastructure. I mean, obviously, cooling towers supposed to cool water during plant's operation. Obviously, the structure seems to be intact. It's no risk of radiation leak or any problem to the nearby town. Enjodar, I think it is, or Engodar, anyway, whatever. And obviously, the IEA have to look into this. And for me, the IEA is just going to have to come out and confirm or deny Russia's allegation. Was it the Ukrainians who did it? And if it did, what's the outcome of this? None of this, we condemn both sides. Let's just say who's responsible. But again, this is a sheer act of desperation. Now, the argument is, if it's a drone, they must have deliberately thought, we'll hit the cooling tower. Because a drone's very specific. I mean, if it was a missile, there's it's plausible they could have been looking to attack one thing and end up attacking something else. But let's not diminish this as potentially a huge risk. I mean, and this is desperation, because that could potentially contaminate not just all of Ukraine, but huge parts of Europe, including Russia, of course, Western Europe. It's kind of potentially Chernobyl all over again. But don't want to blow this out of proportion. I'm just saying it presents a serious environmental risk, which of course is true. But again, it's desperation. Now, people will conflate the timing and go, well, they failed with Kursk, so then they went after Zaporizhzhia. Well, that's again circumstantial evidence. It can look like that. It doesn't prove it is. Again, as I said, going after Zaporizhzhia, they've done it before. But trying to attack Kursk, no. I'm not buying it, because we know what the consequences would be. And the Americans would have to stand back and go, you're on your own, Ukraine. You've blown it this time. We're not getting involved. We're not defending you on the basis of what you have just caused. But clearly it is an act of desperation. But then we have to be careful who's responsible and why did it happen? I mean, was it Zelensky who gave the order? I mean, Ukraine's in a total state of chaos. It's very difficult at times to know who's responsible for what. It's not a functioning country anymore. I mean, forget the economic, financial position. It's just completely in meltdown. There's no governance structure properly in the country. There is enormous amounts of intimidation and people being threatened and not allowed to speak about anything, and all this forced mobilization of people who don't want to go to war. There are, as I said, rumors that after the Kursk debacle, as I would call it, the Ukrainian military is furious with Zelensky. It remains to be seen. But if that's true, that doesn't augur well for him not being removed from office in a sort of coup. There's been talk about that on and off for a long time. It's never come to pass. But so there's lots of problems, lots of issues. But the important thing is, we can discuss this, as Ken and I have done, but don't conflate things. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't have a binary thought process, meaning something bad happens in Ukraine, the Americans are behind it because America is responsible for everything in Ukraine. No, it's not. Just because this didn't happen and this happens, it means you can conflate those two thought processes. No, it doesn't. There are many things going on in Ukraine that you can't conflate. And like everything, whether it's geopolitical, political, everything that's going on, it's very complicated and very convoluted. And there's no point jumping to conclusions. The bottom line is, Ukraine will not succeed in Russian territory. It's impossible. At some point, they'll have to go back, and if they can retreat with minimal loss of casualties, all the better, certainly for the people concerned. And then the question is, what's happened internally with the war itself inside Ukraine? The Americans, as I said, have stated quite clearly, we knew nothing about this. And I actually believe that. I do not think for 1 minute the Americans would have said to Zelensky, yes, we will green light you to invade Russia, because they then are going, hang on, what happens if you use our weapons inside Russia to attack Russian targets? that is the whole game changer in the context of the war. So it remains to be seen. Russia seems to have taken a measured approach to it. Hopefully it stays that way, because you do not want an escalation into a war for the reasons that are very obvious. And I think it's just a lesson in, don't be entertained. Look for people to inform you, people who have an objective perspective and aren't rooting for one side or the other to win a war. The only reason we can excel at what we do is by being objective and saying, if Russia's winning the war, they're winning the war. If Ukraine's winning the war, they're winning the war. If this was a sensible military approach by Ukraine, it's a sensible military approach, or whoever it is. And if it's not, it's not. That's what we're here to do, and that's what we'll intend to do. And we're not trying to sell you anything that's sensationalistic, because ultimately it achieves nothing and it lacks integrity. And without integrity, what's the point in doing what we do?
Very well said. Anyway, Paul, I think we were able to touch on two key important things that are going on in the geopolitical world, especially towards the Ukraine conflict. Other than that, I really don't have much more to add. Do you?
Well, no, worse, we said we'll stick to one subject per podcast. Don't confuse things. Don't put too much in. Just keep it short as possible. And then we'll just come on to another subject next time.
Absolutely. And as Paul said, there is, for individuals, all of you listening, even for us, there is it is okay to speculate. You put evidence together, come to a conclusion, but don't become completely petrified in what what we come to as a thought process until the truth comes out. And to be sure, once that truth comes out, we're going to do our best to make sure you have that information, and not just simply clickbait value. Anyway, Paul, I want to thank you as always for being a part of this great discussion.
And likewise.
And to everybody here, don't forget to subscribe, like, share some comments, share with anybody else. And until the next time we get together, have a great week.